Miss Marple and the charity bazaar that sold more than Trinket Chapter 1. A perfect autumn morning. Village of St. Mary Mead had never looked more charming than it did on that crisp Saturday morning in late September. The ancient chestnut trees lining the high street were just beginning to turn golden, and the air carried the pleasant scent of wood smoke from cottage chimneys. Miss Jane Marple stood at her bedroom window, observing the unusual bustle of activity in the village square below with the quiet interest that had become second nature to her over 70-odd years of life. Today was the day of the annual St. Mary Mead charity Bazaar, an event that had taken place without interruption for the past 43 years. Miss Marple could remember every single one, from her first as a young woman newly arrived in the village, to last year's rather subdued affair following the war. This year, however, promised to be particularly grand. Mrs. Cynthia, the newest arrival to the village, having purchased the old manor house only 18 months prior, had taken it upon herself to revitalize the event. As she put it in her rather commanding voice at the last parish council meeting, Miss Marple's keen blue eyes, still remarkably sharp despite her age, watched as white tents bloomed like oversized mushrooms across the village green. She could see Raymond West, her nephew, who was visiting for the weekend, already making his way toward the commotion with the eager curiosity of a metropolitan writer seeking material for his next novel. He would be disappointed, she thought with a small smile. Village bazaars were delightfully ordinary affairs, full of jam jars and knitted tea cozies, with perhaps a cake stall and a tombola for excitement, or, at least, there usually were at precisely 10 o'clock. Miss Marple made her way down the narrow lane from her cottage basket over her arm. She had contributed a dozen jars of her famous gooseberry preserve to the produce stall, and she was curious to see how Mrs. Fortescue had transformed the traditional event. The village green was already crowded with familiar faces. There was Colonel Bantry and his wife Dolly, examining a display of rather dubious antiques. Miss Weatherby, the village gossip, was stationed strategically near the entrance where she could observe everyone's arrivals. Young Dr. Haydock stood by the refreshment tent, looking slightly harassed as Mrs. Price Ridley lectured him about something, probably her recurring neuralgia, which Miss Marple privately suspected was more imaginary than real. Miss Marple, how delightful to see you. The booming voice belonged to Mrs. Fortescue herself, resplendent in a purple wool suit that seemed rather too formal for a village bazaar. She was a handsome woman in her late 50s, with elaborately coiffed dark hair and a manner that suggested she was accustomed to being obeyed. Her husband, Mr. Gerald Fortescue, trailed behind her like a pale shadow, thin, nervous-looking man with receding grey hair and a perpetually apologetic expression. Such a wonderful turnout. Mrs. Fortescue continued, not waiting for Miss Marple's response. Of course, I did mention to the vicar that we needed to think bigger this year. The village needs to move with the times. We can't simply rely on jam jars and embroidered handkerchiefs anymore, can we? Miss Marple murmured something appropriately polite. She had learned long ago that Mrs. Fortescue preferred an audience to a conversation partner. Now, I must show you our piece de resistance, the diamond bracelet raffle. A genuine Victorian piece, worth at least £200. I donated it myself, naturally. The tickets are 5 shillings each, and all proceeds go to the church roof fund. As Mrs. Fortescue swept away to accost another arrival, Miss Marple caught sight of the display table near the fortune-teller's tent. The bracelet lay on a cushion of blue velvet under a glass dolman, elaborate piece studded with what appeared to be genuine diamonds set in an ornate gold setting, quite out of place among the homemade toffees and second-hand books. Rather vulgar, isn't it? The quiet voice came from behind Miss Marple. She turned to find Miss Lavinia Crane, the village schoolteacher, regarding the bracelet with barely concealed distaste. Miss Crane was a woman of about 40, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "It's certainly generous," Miss Marple replied diplomatically. "Generous." Miss Crane's lips tightened. That woman has done nothing but flaunt her wealth since she arrived. The old manor should have gone to someone who understood the village. Not to some. She stopped abruptly, as if remembering to whom she was speaking. "Forgive me, Miss Marple. I'm afraid I'm not feeling quite myself today." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A young man had arrived, tall and handsome in a rakish sort of way, with dark wavy hair and an easy smile. He moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who knew he was being watched. And indeed, several young women's heads turned as he passed. "Who is that?" Raymond West had materialized at his aunt's elbow, notebook already in hand. "That," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "is Mr. Philip Delroy. He arrived in the village about 3 months ago and has taken rooms at the Blue Boar, an artist, apparently, though I've never seen any of his work. He seems to have become quite friendly with Mrs. Fortescue James." "Has he, indeed?" Raymond's writer's instincts were clearly aroused. Miss Marple watched as Mr. Delroy made his way directly to Mrs. Fortescue James, who received him with a brilliant smile, quite different from the rather patronizing expression she had worn for everyone else. Mr. Fortescue, standing nearby, seemed to shrink even further into himself. The morning proceeded with the gentle chaos typical of village events. Miss Marple purchased several items she didn't need, sampled Mrs. Dane's excellent Victoria sponge, and had her fortune told by Madame Zara, actually Mrs. Harmon from the post office, draped in scarves and speaking in an unconvincing accent. According to Madame Zara, Miss Marple would soon receive unexpected news from abroad, and should beware of a tall, dark stranger. Miss Marple thanked her gravely and moved on. By 1 o'clock, the bazaar was at its peak. The sun had burned through the morning mist, and despite the September chill, many people had removed their coats. The scent of hot dogs and fried onions from the refreshment tent mingled with the sweeter smell of candy floss. Children ran between the stalls, clutching small prizes and balloons. Miss Marple had just settled onto a bench near the diamond bracelet display when she observed something curious. Mr. Delroy, who had been standing near the refreshment tent in conversation with Miss Crane, an odd pairing. Miss Marple thoughts suddenly broke away and approached the diamond bracelet display with an intensity that seemed at odds with his earlier casual manner. He stood for a long moment, examining it closely, his handsome face set in an expression of concentration. Then Mrs. Fortescue James swept over, her voice carrying across the green, "Admiring my little contribution, Philip. Isn't it magnificent?" "Quite remarkable," Mr. Delroy replied, his voice carefully neutral. "Family heirloom, is it?" "Heavens, no. I purchased it at auction in London last year. The proceeds will do wonders for the church roof, don't you think?" At 3 o'clock, the vicar, Mr. Clement, climbed onto a small platform to announce the raffle drawing. The crowd gathered, tickets clutched hopefully in their hands. Miss Marple noticed that Mr. Fortescue James stood apart from his wife, smoking a cigarette with nervous, jerky movements. Miss Crane had disappeared entirely. Dr. Haydock was deep in conversation with Colonel Bantry near the edge of the green. "Ladies and gentlemen," the vicar began, his reedy voice barely carrying over the crowd, "we are delighted to announce that this year's raffle has raised the magnificent sum of £42 for the church roof fund." A polite round of applause followed. "And now, Mrs. Fortescue James will draw the winning ticket." Mrs. Fortescue James mounted the platform with regal bearing. She made rather a production of swirling her hand in the ticket basket before finally extracting a folded slip of paper. "The winning number is ... 247. There was a moment of rustling as people checked their tickets. Then a delighted cry, "That's me. Oh my goodness, that's my ticket." Young Mrs. Larkin, the butcher's wife, pushed forward, her face flushed with excitement. The vicar verified the number, and amid much congratulation, Mrs. Fortescue Germains personally removed the glass dome from the display. She reached for the bracelet. Her hand froze in mid-air. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Mrs. Fortescue James's voice, stripped of all its usual commanding tone, emerged as barely a whisper. "It's gone. The bracelet is gone." The crowd pressed closer. The blue velvet cushion lay empty beneath the now removed glass dome. The Victorian diamond bracelet, worth £200, had vanished, and somewhere in the pleasant chaos of the St. Mary Mead Charity Bazaar, a thief walked free among them. Miss Marple, still seated on her bench, carefully observed every face in the crowd. She noticed who looked genuinely shocked, who looked away too quickly, and who most interestingly didn't look surprised at all. The afternoon, she reflected, had just become considerably more interesting than anyone had anticipated. Chapter 2. Whispers and Accusations. The initial shock that had frozen the crowd dissolved into chaos within moments. Voices rose in confusion, indignation, and Miss Marple noted with interest a certain grim excitement that often accompanies scandal in small communities. "This is absolutely outrageous." Mrs. Price Ridley's strident voice cut through the general hubbub. "Someone call the police immediately." "I already have," Dr. Haydock replied, holding up his mobile phone. "Inspector Slack is on his way from Much Benham." Mrs. Fortescue Germains stood on the platform, her face drained of colour beneath her carefully applied rouge. For the first time since her arrival in St. Mary Mead, she appeared genuinely vulnerable, her usual commanding presence shattered by the theft of her prized possession. Her husband had hurried to her side, one thin hand hovering uncertainly near her elbow, as if he wanted to comfort her, but didn't quite dare. "Gerald," she said, her voice trembling, "that bracelet was insured for £200. How could this have happened? Who would do such a thing?" Mr. Fortescue James made soothing noises that seemed only to agitate his wife further. Miss Marple observed that his pale face had gone even paler, and his hands were shaking noticeably. The vicar, Mr. Clement, attempted to restore order. "Please, everyone, if we could all remain calm. I'm sure this is simply a misunderstanding. Perhaps the bracelet was moved for safekeeping." Moved. Mrs. Fortescue Germains whirled on him. "By whom?" "I personally placed it under that glass dome this morning at 9:30. I checked it again at 11. It was there. And I saw it at 12:30, volunteered Miss Weatherby, her eyes gleaming with the terrible joy of having important information. "I was showing it to my sister-in-law, who's visiting from Torquay. We both admired it particularly." Miss Marple rose from her bench and moved closer to the display table, her movements slow and deliberate as befitted her age. The blue velvet cushion showed a slight depression where the bracelet had lain. The glass dome, now sitting beside the cushion, appeared undamaged. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. "Miss Marple, surely you must step away from there." Miss Weatherby bustled over, her ample form quivering with self-importance. "This is a crime scene." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "I was merely observing." "The glass dome appears to have been removed quite carefully, doesn't it? No scratches on the table, no signs of haste." Colonel Bantry, who had joined them, nodded thoughtfully. "By Jove, you're right. Whoever took it knew exactly what they were doing. Cool as a cucumber, I'd say cool." Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. "I'd call it brazen. Stealing in broad daylight with hundreds of people about. What is the village coming to?" Miss Marple's gaze drifted across the crowd. Mr. Philip Delroy stood near the fortune-teller's tent, his handsome face arranged in an expression of concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. As she watched, he caught the eye of Miss Crane, who had reappeared from wherever she'd been during the raffle drawing. Some silent communication seemed to pass between them before Miss Crane looked away sharply. Raymond West appeared at his aunt's side, his notebook forgotten in his fascination with the real-life drama. "Aunt Jane, this is extraordinary. A theft at a village bazaar. Do you suppose it was planned?" "One would imagine so," Miss Marple replied softly. "Unless, of course, it was a crime of opportunity." Opportunity. Raymond frowned. But surely he was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, a large, red-faced man who had never quite forgiven Miss Marple for solving several cases that had baffled him in the past. He was accompanied by a younger constable whose name Miss Marple didn't know. Right then, Inspector Slack announced in a voice that brooked no argument, "Everyone stay exactly where you are. Nobody leaves until we've taken statements from every person present." A collective groan rose from the crowd. It was now nearly 4 o'clock, and the pleasant autumn afternoon was growing decidedly chilly. Several mothers with young children looked particularly distressed. Inspector Slack made his way to the platform where Mrs. Fortescue-Germaise waited, her composure partially restored now that official authority had arrived. "Mrs. Fortescue-Gens, if you could describe exactly what happened." As Mrs. Fortescue-Gens launched into her account, Miss Marple noticed several other things. Mr. Fortescue-James had slipped away from his wife's side and was now standing near the edge of the green, lighting another cigarette with trembling hands. Dr. Haydock was in quiet conversation with Miss Crane, who appeared to be crying, though she was clearly trying to hide it, and Mr. Delroy had disappeared entirely. "I tell you, it had to be someone from outside the village," Mrs. Dane was saying to a cluster of women near the cake stall. "None of us would do such a thing." "I'm not so sure," Mrs. Harmon replied darkly, still wearing her Madame Zara scarves. "There are secrets in every village, aren't there? People aren't always what they seem." Miss Marple reflected that this was quite true, though perhaps not in the way Mrs. Harmon intended. The questioning proceeded slowly. Inspector Slack established that the bracelet had definitely been in place at 12:30, as confirmed by multiple witnesses. The raffle drawing had begun at 3 o'clock. Somewhere in that 2.5-hour window, someone had calmly lifted the glass dome and stolen a £200 bracelet in full view of nearly 100 people. "It's impossible," Inspector Slack declared in frustration. "How could anyone remove that dome without being seen?" But Miss Marple, watching the afternoon light slant across the empty velvet cushion, thought it wasn't impossible at all. In fact, it was rather simple, provided one understood human nature and the art of misdirection. The question, as always, was not how, the question was why, and perhaps more importantly, the question was who among these familiar faces had secrets worth £200, and what those secrets might drive them to do. Chapter 3. The shadows lengthened by 5 o'clock. The golden September afternoon had taken on a distinctly melancholy cast. Long shadows stretched across the village green, and the white tents that had seemed so festive that morning now appeared stark and slightly sinister in the fading light. The bunting fluttered in a chill breeze that carried the promise of autumn's deeper cold. Inspector Slack had commandeered the vicar's tent as a makeshift interrogation room, and the villagers stood about in uncomfortable clusters, waiting their turn to be questioned. The initial excitement had worn off, replaced by a growing sense of unease. The theft had transformed neighbors into potential suspects, and familiar faces now regarded each other with glances and barely concealed speculation. Miss Marple had declined the folding chair offered by the vicar, and instead perched on a low stone wall that bordered the green, her knitting needles clicking in a steady rhythm. She had learned long ago that people were far more likely to speak freely around someone who appeared occupied with something harmless. The pink wool emerging from her needles was destined to become a baby jacket for Mrs. Larkin's expected child. The same Mrs. Larkin who had won the no-varnished bracelet. It's terribly unfair, isn't it? Young Mrs. Larkin herself had approached, her earlier excitement replaced by distress. She was a pretty woman of about 25, with soft brown curls and a sweetness of expression that reminded Miss Marple of a spaniel puppy. I've never won anything in my life, and now this happens. Tom, that's my husband, he says. I'm jinxed. I don't believe in jinxes, dear, Miss Marple replied gently, though I do believe in human greed, which is rather more dangerous. Mrs. Larkin twisted her handkerchief anxiously. Do you think they'll catch whoever did it? Inspector Slack seems to think it was someone from outside the village, but she lowered her voice. That Mr. Delroy, he was asking me earlier if I knew anything about the bracelet, what it was worth, where Mrs. Fortescue-Gemans had bought it. Seemed rather interested, I thought. Did he, indeed? Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment before resuming their rhythm. And what did you tell him? Only what everyone knows, that she bought it at auction in London and that it was Victorian. Mrs. Larkin hesitated. Miss Marple, you don't think he could have taken it? He's always been so charming to me, helping me carry my shopping and such. But Tom says a man that handsome, who's friendly to everyone, must be after something. Before Miss Marple could respond, a raised voice from the vicar's tent drew everyone's attention. Mr. Fortescue-James had emerged, his thin face flushed with anger, or perhaps fear. This is preposterous, he was saying, his voice higher than usual. I won't be interrogated like a common criminal. My wife has been robbed, and instead of finding the thief, you're wasting time questioning me. Inspector Slack appeared in the tent opening, his face thunderous. Mr. Fortescue-James, I am questioning everyone who had access to the display. Now, if you'll just answer my questions, I've told you everything I know. I was nowhere near that display table between 12:30 and 3 o'clock. I was at the refreshment tent, smoking, trying to escape my wife's endless social obligations. Mr. Fortescue-James fumbled for his cigarette case with shaking hands. If you want to know who took that blasted bracelet, why don't you ask Philip Delroy? He's been sniffing around my wife for months, and he seemed remarkably interested in her jewellery. A shocked silence fell over the green. Mrs. Fortescue-James, who had been standing nearby with Mrs. Dane, went rigid. Her face, already pale, became almost translucent. "Gerald," she said, in a voice like ice, "that is quite enough." But Mr. Fortescue Germaise, having finally found his voice, seemed unable to stop. Is it enough? Everyone knows he's been calling at the manor constantly. Everyone's been talking about it. And now her precious bracelet disappears, and I'm the one being treated like a suspect. Mr. Fortescue Germaise. The vicar stepped forward, his mild face distressed. "Please, this isn't helping anyone." But the damage was done. The careful veneer of village civility had cracked, and through that crack, Miss Marple glimpsed the roiling emotions beneath jealousy, resentment, fear, and something darker that she couldn't quite identify yet. Mrs. Fortescue Germaise drew herself up to her full height. "Inspector Slack, I wish to make a formal statement. My husband is clearly overwrought and doesn't know what he's saying. Mr. Delroy is a respected artist who has been commissioned to paint my portrait. His visits to the manor have been entirely professional and properly chaperoned. Any suggestion otherwise is slanderous. Is that so?" Colonel Bantry's gruff voice carried across the green. "Funny sort of artist who never seems to have any paintings to show. Been here 3 months, and I've yet to see a single canvas." Miss Crane, who had been standing quietly in the shadows, suddenly spoke up. "Mr. Delroy is very particular about his work. He doesn't show unfinished pieces." Several heads turned toward her, surprised. Miss Crane rarely involved herself in village disputes, preferring to maintain a strict boundary between her professional life at the school and her private affairs. "You seem very well informed about Mr. Delroy's habits, Miss Crane," Mrs. Price Ridley observed with barely concealed insinuation. Miss Crane's pale face flushed. "I've had occasion to speak with him, that's all. He's an educated man, unlike some in this village who seem to thrive on gossip and innuendo." "Ladies, please." Dr. Haydock intervened, his usually jovial manner strained. "This isn't accomplishing anything. We're all tired and upset. Perhaps we should find the thief," Miss Weatherby interrupted shrilly. "That's what we should do. My sister-in-law and I were standing right by that display table for at least 10 minutes at 1:30, and we saw Mr. Delroy examining it very closely indeed. I was admiring a beautiful piece of jewelry," a smooth voice said from behind them. Philip Delroy had reappeared, his handsome face composed but his eyes watchful. "Is that now a crime, Mrs. Weatherby?" "It is when that jewelry disappears shortly afterward." Mr. Delroy's smile didn't waver, but Miss Marple noticed that his hands, thrust casually into his pockets, were clenched into fists. "I'm sure Inspector Slack will sort this all out. I have nothing to hide." But Miss Marple, watching the interplay of glances, Mrs. Fortescue Germaise's anxious look toward Mr. Delroy, Miss Crane's quickly concealed distress, Mr. Fortescue James's bitter triumph, thought that everyone present had something to hide. The question was which secret had driven someone to theft, and what other secrets might yet come to light before the mystery was solved. Chapter 4. A web of connections. Darkness had begun to settle over St. Mary Mead by the time Inspector Slack finally allowed people to leave the village green. The fairy lights strung between the tents, meant to add a festive touch to the evening portion of the bazaar, now cast eerie shadows across faces drawn with fatigue and suspicion. The event that was to have concluded with dancing and merriment instead ended with villagers departing in tight-lipped silence, casting backward glances as though the thief might still be lurking among the abandoned stalls. Miss Marple, walked slowly homeward, Raymond at her elbow offering his arm, which she accepted with quiet gratitude. The day had been longer than she cared to admit, and her bones ached with the particular weariness that comes from hours of observation and mental calculation. Extraordinary business. "Aunt Jane," Raymond said as they turned down the lane toward her cottage, "that fellow Delroy seems the obvious suspect, doesn't he? Stranger in the village, mysteriously intimate with Mrs. Fortescue James. No visible means of support. It's almost too perfect." "Yes, dear," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Almost too perfect. That's what troubles me." Raymond looked at her sharply. "You think he's innocent?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mr. Delroy is many things, but obvious is not one of them. A man who wishes to steal a valuable bracelet does not spend weeks drawing attention to himself and his interest in the victim's jewelry. It would be remarkably stupid, and whatever else Mr. Delroy may be, I don't believe he's stupid." They had reached her front gate when they heard hurried footsteps behind them. Dr. Haydock emerged from the gloom, his medical bag swinging at his side. "Miss Marple, I'm glad I caught you. Might I have a word? It's rather important." Raymond tactfully excused himself to prepare tea, leaving Miss Marple alone with the doctor in her small sitting room. Dr. Haydock, usually the most cheerful of men, looked deeply troubled. He waited until Raymond had closed the door to the kitchen before speaking. "I've just come from the manor," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Fortescue James sent for me. She's had rather a shock beyond the theft." "I mean," Miss Marple settled into her favorite chair and waited. Dr. Haydock had been the village doctor for 30 years, and she knew him to be both discreet and perspicacious. "She received a note," he continued, lowering his voice, though they were quite alone. "Slipped under her door sometime this evening while she was still being questioned at the Green. Anonymous, naturally. It said," he paused, clearly uncomfortable. "It said, 'The bracelet is nothing compared to what you've already lost. Ask your husband about his London trips.'" Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their clicking, paused momentarily. "How very unpleasant. And Mrs. Fortescue James showed you this note. She was nearly hysterical. Wanted me to tell her she was imagining things, that the note was nonsense." But Miss Marple, Dr. Haydock leaned forward. "I've been treating Mr. Fortescue James for nervous exhaustion these past 3 months. The man's been under tremendous strain. He's mentioned financial difficulties, though his wife seems unaware of them. And he's been making trips to London, weekly trips that he told me were for business, but which seemed to distress him enormously." "I see," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "And you're wondering if Mr. Fortescue James might have stolen his own wife's bracelet to settle some debt?" "It did cross my mind, though it seems rather elaborate, doesn't it? Staging a theft at a public event when he could have simply taken it from her jewelry box at home. Unless," Miss Marple suggested gently, "he wanted it to appear that someone else had stolen it. A man in financial difficulties might find an insurance claim rather convenient." Dr. Haydock looked uncomfortable. "I shouldn't be discussing a patient's private affairs, but given the circumstances, Mrs. Fortescue James also mentioned that Miss Crane came to see her last week. Apparently, Miss Crane was looking for a reference. She's applied for a position at a girls' school in Bath. Mrs. Fortescue James, rather cruelly I thought, refused to provide one. Said that Miss Crane's teaching methods were outdated and that she couldn't, in good conscience, recommend her." This information settled into Miss Marple's mind like a puzzle piece finding its place. Miss Crane, desperate for a new position, and refused a reference by the most influential woman in the village. Miss Crane, who had been noticeably absent during the crucial time when the bracelet disappeared. Miss Crane, who seemed to know rather more about Philip Delroy than one would expect from mere casual acquaintance. "Thank you, Doctor," Miss Marple said. "You've been most helpful." After Dr. Haydock had departed, Miss Marple sat in the gathering darkness, her tea growing cold beside her. Raymond found her there an hour later, still sitting motionless, her knitting forgotten in her lap. "Aunt Jane, are you all right?" "Perfectly well, dear. I was just thinking about human nature. It's a fascinating study, you know. We all wear masks, some more successfully than others. But crisis has a way of making those masks slip. You've thought of something, haven't you? You know who took the bracelet?" "I have several theories," Miss Marple admitted. "But theories are not proof, and in matters of theft, one must be very careful. A false accusation can destroy a life as surely as any crime." She rose from her chair and moved to the window, looking out at the village square where the white tents still stood like ghostly sentinels. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone was congratulating themselves on a successful theft. Or perhaps this was the thought that troubled Miss Marple. Most perhaps they were regretting it already, trapped by circumstances they hadn't fully anticipated. "Raymond," she said suddenly, "do you remember mentioning earlier that Mr. Delroy seemed to have no visible means of support?" "Yes, why?" "Because I've just remembered something Miss Crane said this afternoon. She mentioned that Mr. Delroy was very particular about his work. Not his art, mind you, but his work. An interesting choice of words, don't you think?" Raymond frowned. "I don't quite follow." "No, dear," Miss Marple said softly, "but I rather think I do. The question now is what to do about it." Outside, a church bell tolled the hour, its notes floating across the village like a warning or perhaps a summons to truth. Chapter 5. Secrets in the morning light. Sunday morning dawned grey and drizzling, the kind of persistent English rain that seemed to seep into one's very bones. Miss Marple attended the early service at St. Mary's, observing with interest that several key players in yesterday's drama were conspicuously absent. Mrs. Fortescue-James's usual pew stood empty, as did Miss Crane's modest seat near the back. Mr. Fortescue-James appeared alone, looking haggard and diminished in his dark suit, his eyes fixed on some middle distance that suggested his thoughts were far from the vicar's sermon on charity and forgiveness. After the service, Miss Marple found herself sharing an umbrella with Mrs. Dane on the short walk back through the churchyard. Mrs. Dane, the baker's wife, was one of those comfortable, sensible women who observed much but spoke little equality Miss Marple had always appreciated. "Terrible business yesterday," Mrs. Dane remarked, navigating around a puddle. "The whole village is talking of nothing else. My husband says Inspector Slack questioned him for 20 minutes about whether he'd seen anyone suspicious near the display table, as if Bob would notice anything beyond his own pastries." "I imagine the inspector is being very thorough," Miss Marple replied. "Thorough, yes, but is he looking in the right direction?" Mrs. Dane lowered her voice, though the rain-swept churchyard was nearly empty. "I haven't mentioned this to the inspector, Miss Marple, but I saw something yesterday that struck me as odd." Miss Marple's expression remained pleasantly interested, but her attention sharpened. "Oh, it was around 2 o'clock, perhaps a bit before. I'd gone behind the refreshment tent to fetch more napkins from my car. Miss Crane was there, standing by herself, and she was crying. Not just watery eyes, mind you, but really crying the sort of crying that comes from genuine distress. When she saw me, she tried to hide it, said something about hay fever, but Miss Marple, it's September. There's no hay about. How very observant of you. Mrs. Dane, well, I thought about mentioning it yesterday, but it seemed like tale-telling, and I've no wish to make trouble for poor Miss Crane. She's had a difficult time of it since her mother died last year. But then I heard, Mrs. Dane hesitated. You know how people talk. I heard that Miss Crane has been making inquiries about selling her mother's jewelry. Old pieces, family heirlooms. The jeweler in Much Benham mentioned it to my husband. Said Miss Crane seemed desperate for the money, kept asking if he could value them higher than they were worth. They had reached the lane where their paths would diverge. Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Dane for sharing her umbrella, her mind already working through this new information. A woman in financial desperation, recently crying, asking about the value of jewelry and, intimately acquainted with the one man in the village, whose profession might involve the acquisition and disposal of valuable items, instead of returning directly home. Miss Marple made her way to the village square. The white tents had been taken down during the night, and the green looked forlorn in the rain, littered with abandoned programs and a few forgotten balloons sagging damply against the grass. But it was not the green that interested her. The Blue Boar Inn stood on the corner, its ancient timbers dark with rain. Miss Marple had known the landlady, Mrs. Trimble, for 40 years, and Mrs. Trimble was not one to turn away an old friend, even on a wet Sunday morning. Miss Marple, come in out of that dreadful weather. Mrs. Trimble ushered her into the warm interior, where a fire crackled in the public room's hearth. I'll fetch you a nice cup of tea. You'll catch your death. Over tea and Mrs. Trimble's excellent shortbread, Miss Marple carefully steered the conversation toward her true purpose. I understand you have Mr. Delroy staying here. Such an interesting young man. An artist, I believe. Mrs. Trimble's comfortable face tightened almost imperceptibly. So he says, Miss Marple, though in 3 months I've seen no paintings come or go. He receives a great deal of post, though packages from London, sometimes from abroad. Keeps odd hours too, often out until very late. Does he have many visitors? Now that you mention it, yes. Miss Crane has called on him several times, always very proper, mind you, conversations in the public lounge. But there's been others too. A gentleman from London came twice last month, very well dressed, carrying a briefcase. They spoke in Mr. Delroy's room for hours. Mrs. Trimble leaned closer. And I'll tell you something else, Miss Marple, though I shouldn't gossip. Last Tuesday, I was cleaning the corridor, and I heard Mr. Delroy on the telephone. He was speaking in a foreign language, French, I think, and he sounded angry. I distinctly heard him say something about authentication and original provenance. Odd words for an artist to use, wouldn't you say? Miss Marple agreed that it was, indeed, odd, though she suspected she was beginning to understand exactly what Mr. Delroy's true profession might be. The question was whether his profession had any bearing on the theft of the bracelet, or whether that was merely a convenient distraction from something else entirely. She was walking back toward her cottage, turning these thoughts over in her mind, when she nearly collided with Mr. Fortescue James, hurrying in the opposite direction. He was without an umbrella, his thin hair plastered to his skull by the rain, and his eyes had a wild, desperate quality. Mr. Fortescue James, are you quite well? He stopped, seeming to focus on her with difficulty. Miss Marple? No, I'm not well. I'm not well at all. I've been a fool, you see. A terrible fool. And now, he broke off, looking over his shoulder as if pursued. I can't talk now. I have tooth. There's something I must do. He pushed past her and continued up the lane at an almost frantic pace, leaving Miss Marple standing in the rain with the distinct impression that whatever web of deception surrounded the missing bracelet was about to tighten considerably. She made her way home slowly, her mind cataloguing facts and observations. A desperate a mysterious artist with suspicious connections, a nervous husband with financial troubles, a wealthy wife who collected expensive jewelry, and somewhere among all these tangled relationships and hidden motives, a Victorian diamond bracelet worth £200 had vanished into thin air. Or had it? A new thought struck Miss Marple with such force that she stopped walking entirely, oblivious to the rain soaking through her sensible coat. What if the bracelet's disappearance wasn't the crime at all? What if it was merely the symptom of something far more complex, sand, far more dangerous? Chapter 6. The pattern emerges by Monday afternoon. The atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had grown distinctly oppressive. The rain had continued without respite, transforming the village lanes into streams of mud and creating an air of confinement that seemed to press upon everyone's spirits. Miss Marple sat in her parlour, ostensibly working on her embroidery, but in truth, she was waiting. She had learned long ago that in matters of human wrongdoing, patience was often more valuable than action. People under pressure made mistakes, revealed things they meant to keep hidden, and the people of St. Mary Mead were very much under pressure. The knock at her door came at 3:30. Raymond admitted Inspector Slack, who entered with a grim expression and dripping raincoat. Miss Marple, he said without preamble, I need to ask you about your observations at the Bazaar. Every detail you can remember about who was where and when. Of course, Inspector. Please, do sit down. Raymond, would you fetch the inspector some tea? Once they were settled, Inspector Slack pulled out his notebook with an air of resignation. I might as well tell you, Miss Marple, we're getting nowhere. I've questioned everyone in the village, searched Mr. Delroy's room at the Blue Boar with his permission, found nothing but art supplies and some correspondence with galleries in London. The bracelet has simply vanished. Have you spoken with the insurance company? Miss Marple asked innocently. Inspector Slack's face darkened. That's just it. I contacted them this morning. The bracelet was insured, right enough, but the policy was only taken out 3 weeks ago. Before that, it wasn't insured at all. Mrs. Fortescue-Germain claims she simply forgot to insure it when she first purchased it last year. How very convenient, Miss Marple murmured. My thoughts exactly. But that's not all. He leaned forward. I've been making inquiries in London. That auction house where Mrs. Fortescue-Germain claims to have purchased the bracelet. They have no record of any Victorian diamond bracelet matching that description being sold in the past 2 years. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her eyes were bright with interest. No record at all. None. Either she bought it elsewhere and lied about it, or he paused significantly, or the bracelet itself was not what it appeared to be. Miss Marple finished softly. Tell me, Inspector, did you happen to examine the bracelet closely on Saturday morning? I saw it, yes. Looked genuine enough to me, though I'm no expert on jewelry. Neither am I, Miss Marple admitted. But I do know something about human nature, and I noticed that Mr. Delroy examined that bracelet very carefully indeed. Not with the admiration of someone appreciating beauty, but with the scrutiny of someone assessing authenticity. Inspector Slack stared at her. "You think it was fake?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Mr. Delroy might have thought so. And I believe that's why he was so interested in it." Before the inspector could respond, there was a commotion outside, raised voices and hurried footsteps. Raymond opened the door to find Dr. Haydock on the threshold, his face pale and strained. "Inspector Slack, thank God you're here. You need to come to the manor immediately. It's Mr. Fortescue Germain. He's attempted to take his own life." The journey to the old manor house was accomplished in grim silence. The imposing Victorian structure loomed against the grey sky, its windows blazing with light despite the afternoon hour. Mrs. Fortescue James met them in the entrance hall, her composed facade finally shattered. Her face was blotchy with tears, her carefully coiffed hair dishevelled. "He's in his study," she said, her voice breaking. "I found him an hour ago. He'd taken sleeping tablets too many. Dr. Haydock says he'll recover, but he left a note." She held out a crumpled piece of paper with trembling hands. "He confessed to stealing the bracelet." Inspector Slack took the note, scanning it quickly before reading aloud. "I can no longer live with the deception. I took the bracelet during the raffle drawing, when everyone's attention was elsewhere. I intended to sell it to cover my gambling debts. I am sorry for the pain I have caused." "Gerald Fortescue James there," Mrs. Fortescue James said bitterly. "Are you satisfied? My husband is a thief and a coward. I suppose the whole village will know by tomorrow." But Miss Marple, studying the note over Inspector Slack's shoulder, felt a growing unease. The handwriting was Mr. Fortescue James's. Certainly she had seen his signature on parish documents often enough. But something about the phrasing struck her as wrong. "Mrs. Fortescue James," she said gently, "may I ask when you last saw the bracelet?" "I mean, before the bazaar." "Friday evening. I wore it to dinner. We had guests. Mr. Delroy was dining with us." Her voice hardened on his name. "He admired it particularly, asked about its history. And after dinner, I placed it in my jewelry box, as I always do. Saturday morning, I retrieved it to display at the bazaar." She looked at Miss Marple with red-rimmed eyes. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, my dear. I'm merely trying to understand the timeline." Miss Marple paused. "This dinner party, who else attended?" "Just the three of us. Gerald was supposed to join us, but he claimed he wasn't feeling well and took his meal in his study. He'd been behaving very strangely all week, nervous, distracted. Now I know why." Inspector Slack had moved toward the study where Mr. Fortescue James was being tended. Miss Marple followed slowly, her mind working through the implications. A confession seemed to solve everything, and yet it felt wrong, like a piece forced into a puzzle where it didn't quite fit in the study. Mr. Fortescue James lay on a sofa, his breathing shallow but steady. Dr. Haydock sat beside him, monitoring his pulse. "He'll sleep for several hours," the doctor said quietly. "When he wakes, he should be well enough to answer questions." But Miss Marple wondered what questions could be answered by a man who had been driven to such desperate measures. Was his confession genuine? Or was he protecting someone, or perhaps being protected against his will? She moved to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. In the distance, a figure was visible hurrying along the lane-mist crane, her head bent against the weather, walking with the purposeful stride of someone who had finally made a difficult decision. "Inspector," Miss Marple said suddenly, "I believe we should speak with Miss Crane today, if possible." Inspector Slack looked surprised. "Why? We have our confession, do we? Miss Marple turned to face him, her mild blue eyes suddenly sharp. Or do we have a desperate man taking blame for something far more complicated than a simple theft? The rain drummed against the windows, and somewhere in the house, a clock chimed the hour, a sound that seemed less like the marking of time than a countdown to some inevitable revelation. Chapter 7. Unraveling threads. Miss Crane's cottage stood at the far end of the village. A modest brick structure with ivy climbing its walls and a small garden that had once been meticulously maintained but now showed signs of neglect. The rain had finally ceased, leaving behind a world that glistened with moisture and the fresh, earthy scent of wet soil. Inspector Slack had been reluctant to pursue Miss Marple's suggestion, but something in her quiet insistence had persuaded him. Now they stood at Miss Crane's door, the inspector, Miss Marple, and Dr. Haydock, who had insisted on accompanying them. "This feels like persecution," Inspector Slack muttered. "The woman's a respectable We have a confession. We have a piece of paper," Miss Marple corrected gently. "That's not quite the same thing." Miss Crane answered the door after several moments, and Miss Marple was struck by the change in her appearance. The severe woman who had always maintained such rigid composure looked haggard, her grey hair unpinned and hanging loosely around her shoulders. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she wore an old dressing gown despite the afternoon hour. "Inspector," she said, her voice hoarse, "I've been expecting you. Please, come in." The cottage's interior reflected its owner's circumstances, neat but threadbare, with furniture that had seen better days and walls bare of decoration save for a few faded photographs. Miss Crane gestured them toward the small sitting room, where a fire burned low in the grate. "I know why you're here," Miss Crane said before anyone could speak. She sank into a chair as though her legs could no longer support her. "You've found out about the bracelet, about what it really was." Inspector Slack exchanged a sharp glance with Miss Mop. "Suppose you tell us what you know, Miss Crane." "It was a forgery," Miss Crane said flatly. "A very good one, but a forgery nonetheless. I knew it the moment I saw it on Saturday morning. You see, I recognized the piece. It belonged to my grandmother, the real bracelet, I mean. My mother sold it 15 years ago when my father died and left us with nothing but debts." The room fell silent, save for the crackling of the fire. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her expression intent. "I never forgot that bracelet," Miss Crane continued, her voice trembling. "It was the last link to our family's better days. When I saw Mrs. Fortescue Gomez displaying it at the Bazaar, claiming it was hers, I was furious. But then she paused, pressing her hands to her face. Then I looked more closely, and I realized it wasn't the original. The clasp was wrong, and the setting on one of the stones was slightly different. It was a copy. How can you be certain?" Dr. Haydock asked gently. "Because I had seen the original hundreds of times. I used to play with it as a child. My grandmother would let me try it on. Every detail was burned into my memory." Miss Crane looked up at them with anguished eyes. "I confronted Philip Mr. Delroy about it. You see, we'd become ... acquainted. He'd been kind to me, seemed interested in my thoughts on art and literature. I trusted him." "And what did Mr. Delroy say?" Inspector Slack had his notebook out now, his skepticism replaced by sharp attention. He admitted it immediately. "He's not an artist, not in the conventional sense. He's an art dealer who specializes in authentication and, occasionally, in reproducing pieces for insurance purposes. Legal reproductions," he insisted, for collectors who want to display copies while keeping originals in vaults. Miss Crane's voice grew bitter. He told me that Mrs. Fortescue Gems had commissioned him to create the reproduction. The real bracelet, my grandmother's bracelet, was to be kept safe while she displayed the fake at public events. Miss Marple's knitting needles had gone still. But why would Mrs. Fortescue James do such a thing? Philip said she'd become paranoid about theft. She wanted to flaunt her jewelry but not risk losing it. He showed me documentation, a contract between them for his services. Everything appeared legitimate. Miss Crane's hands twisted in her lap, but I didn't believe him. I thought he was part of some scheme, that perhaps he'd stolen the real bracelet and replaced it with a fake without Mrs. Fortescue James's knowledge. So you decided to steal the reproduction? Inspector Slack's tone was sharp. No. Miss Crane's denial was vehement. I would never, she broke off, tears streaming down her face. I went to Mrs. Fortescue James on Friday. I asked her directly about the bracelet, about whether she knew it was a reproduction. She looked at me as though I'd lost my mind. She insisted it was absolutely genuine, that she'd purchased it at auction, that she had documentation proving its authenticity. What did you do then? Miss Marple asked softly. I told her she was being deceived, that the bracelet was a fake. She became furious, accused me of jealousy and spite. That's when she refused to provide me with a reference for the bath position. She said I was clearly becoming unstable and that she couldn't, in good conscience, recommend me to another school. Miss Crane's voice dropped to a whisper. My career is finished, Miss Marple. Without a reference from the wife of the manor, no respectable school will hire me. Dr. Haydock moved to her side, his physician's instincts overriding the investigation. Miss Crane, you're overwrought. Let me, there's more, Miss Crane interrupted, looking directly at Miss Marple. On Saturday, during the bazaar, I saw something. I was behind the refreshment tent. Mrs. Dane saw me crying there. I'd been working up the courage to confront Philip again, to demand the truth. But when I came back to the green, I saw Mr. Fortescue Gems near the display table. He was alone, and he was looking at the bracelet with such an expression, not greed, but absolute despair. Then someone called to him, and he moved away. But Miss Marple, I think he knew. I think he'd discovered his wife had been deceived, and he couldn't bear it. Or perhaps, Inspector Slack said grimly, he'd discovered something else entirely. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her movements deliberate. Inspector, I believe we need to speak with Mr. Delroy immediately, and we need to examine whatever documentation he has regarding his arrangement with Mrs. Fortescue James. You think there's more to this than a simple forgery? Dr. Haydock asked. I think, Miss Marple said, her voice carrying an unusual edge, that we've been looking at this crime from entirely the wrong angle. The theft of the bracelet wasn't the point at all. It was merely the inevitable consequence of a much more elaborate deception, one that has trapped several people in its web. She moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at Miss Crane's crumpled form. My dear, I suggest you rest. I believe this matter will be resolved shortly, and when it is, you may find that your reputation will be restored more thoroughly than you imagine. As they stepped out into the damp evening air, Inspector Slack cleared his throat. Miss Marple, are you saying you know who took the bracelet? I'm saying, Miss Marple replied, that I know why it was taken. The who will follow naturally from the why. It always does. Chapter 8. The Truth Behind the Fakadeth Blue. Boar's public lounge had taken on an atmosphere of tense expectation by the time Miss Marple, Inspector Slack, and Dr. Haydock arrived. Mrs. Trimble had reluctantly agreed to allow them use of the private parlour, and she now hovered anxiously in the doorway as Philip Delroy was summoned from his room. He descended the stairs with his characteristic grace, though Miss Marple detected a new wariness in his dark eyes. He had exchanged his usual casual attire for a well-cut suit, as though he'd been preparing for an important engagement or perhaps for flight. "Inspector," he said smoothly, settling into a chair with apparent ease. "I assume this concerns Mrs. Fortescue-James's bracelet. I've already told you everything I know, have you?" Inspector Slack's tone was deliberately neutral. "Then perhaps you'd care to explain why you failed to mention that you created a reproduction of that bracelet for Mrs. Fortescue-James." A flicker of something surprise. Calculation crossed Delroy's handsome face before his expression smoothed into careful blankness. "I see Miss Crane has been talking. Yes, I create reproductions for clients who wish to keep valuable pieces secure while still enjoying them publicly. There's nothing illegal about it." "Show us the contract," Miss Marple said quietly. Delroy's eyes met hers, and in that moment she saw acknowledgement of a worthy opponent. "The contract is confidential. Client privilege. There is no such thing as client privilege for art dealers, Mr. Delroy," Inspector Slack said sharply. "And if you refuse to cooperate, I can obtain a warrant to search your room and seize all your papers." A long moment passed. The mantel clock ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, Delroy rose and went to his room, returning with a leather portfolio. From it, he extracted a single sheet of paper and laid it on the table. Miss Marple leaned forward to examine it. The document appeared professionally prepared, dated 3 months prior, stipulating that Philip Delroy would create a museum-quality reproduction of a Victorian diamond bracelet for the sum of £150, with the work to be completed within 8 weeks. Mrs. Fortescue-James's signature. Inspector Slack asked. "Yes, and perfectly legitimate." But Miss Marple's sharp eyes had caught something. "Dr. Haydock, you've seen Mrs. Fortescue-James's handwriting recently, haven't you?" The anonymous note she received. Dr. Haydock moved closer, studying the signature. His expression grew troubled. "Inspector, I'm not a handwriting expert, but this signature doesn't look quite right. The loops are different, and the pressure, because it's not her signature." A new voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned to find Mrs. Fortescue-James herself standing there, rain-soaked and breathless, as though she'd run all the way from the manor. Her face was pale but composed with the terrible calm that comes after a great shock. "I've never seen this document before in my life," she continued, moving into the room. "I never commissioned any reproduction. That bracelet was genuine, or so I believed." She turned to Delroy, her eyes blazing. "You deceived me. You deceived all of us." "Mrs. Fortescue-James," Inspector Slack began, "perhaps you should sit down." "I will not sit down. I've just discovered that my husband attempted suicide because of lies and manipulations, and I will have the truth." She advanced on Delroy. "You wormed your way into my confidence, flattered me, offered to paint my portrait all while planning this scheme. What was your game? Steal the original and replace it with a fake. Collect payment for a reproduction that was actually the real bracelet." Delroy's composure had finally cracked. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You don't understand. I never stole anything. The bracelet you displayed at the bazaar was the one you gave me. I gave you nothing. Your husband did." Delroy's voice had risen. "He came to me 6 weeks ago with the bracelet, claiming you'd asked him to commission a reproduction as a surprise for your anniversary. He paid me £100 and said you'd pay the remaining 50 when the work was completed. I had no reason to doubt him. The silence that followed was profound. Mrs. Fortescue James swayed slightly, and Dr. Haydock moved to support her. Gerald came to you. Her voice was barely a whisper. My husband. Miss Marple spoke gently. Mrs. Fortescue James, when did you last wear the bracelet before the bazaar? At dinner on Friday, with Mr. Delroy as our guest. She looked confused. But I wore it Saturday morning as well. I took it from my jewelry box myself. Are you quite certain it was the same bracelet? Mrs. Fortescue James opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. Her face went even paler. The clasp. I remember now the clasp felt slightly different when I fastened it Saturday morning. I thought I was imagining things, that it was just stiff from disuse. But it wasn't the same bracelet, was it? No, Miss Marple said. I believe Mr. Delroy is telling the truth about one thing. He did create a reproduction. But the bracelet he was given to copy was itself already a forgery. Your husband had already replaced the real bracelet with a fake before he even approached Mr. Delroy. But why? Mrs. Fortescue James looked stricken. Why would Gerald do such a thing? The gambling debts, Dr. Haydock said quietly. He mentioned them in his confession note. Miss Marple, you think he sold the real bracelet to pay his debts? I think, Miss Marple said, that the situation is more complicated than that, Mr. Delroy. You said Mr. Fortescue James came to you 6 weeks ago. Did he seem nervous? Frightened, perhaps? Delroy nodded slowly. He was sweating, stammering. I assumed he was anxious about deceiving his wife with the surprise, but no. He seemed terrified, because he'd already committed a crime and was trying to cover his tracks. Inspector Slack concluded. He sells the real bracelet, replaces it with a cheap forgery, then has Delroy create a better forgery to replace his cheap one. When that better forgery is displayed at the bazaar and then stolen, no one's the wiser because they think the stolen bracelet was the original. Except, Miss Marple said, her voice carrying a note of finality, that Mr. Fortescue James didn't steal his own wife's bracelet. Someone else did, someone who understood exactly what they were taking and why. She looked around the room at the assembled faces. The question we must ask ourselves is this: who benefits from the theft of a forgery? Not Mrs. Fortescue James, who believed it genuine. Not Mr. Fortescue James, who would gain nothing from its disappearance. Not Mr. Delroy, whose professional reputation would be damaged by association with fraud. So who? The answer hung in the air, unspoken but increasingly clear to those who could read the patterns of human behavior as Miss Marple could. Chapter 9. The missing piece the morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. She had just finished her breakfast and was settling into her chair. By the window when Raymond announced that Mr. Fortescue James was asking to see her, he entered hesitantly, a broken man who seemed to have aged a decade in 3 days. His hands trembled as he removed his hat, and his eyes couldn't quite meet hers. Miss Marple, I understand you've been investigating the theft. Dr. Haydock suggested I speak with you. He sank into the chair she offered, his thin frame collapsing like a marionette with cut strings. My confession, it was false. I know, Miss Marple said gently. His head snapped up, surprise breaking through his misery. You know, a man who gambles away his fortune doesn't write notes about deception and pain he's caused. He writes about shame and weakness. Your note read like a man trying to protect someone or perhaps to draw attention away from the real crime. She poured him tea with steady hands. "Why don't you tell me what really happened, Mr. Fortescue?" From the beginning, he accepted the cup gratefully, though his hands shook so badly that tea sloshed into the saucer. "I never gambled. That was a lie I told Dr. Haydock to explain my trips to London. The truth is far worse." He drew a shuddering breath. "Miss Marple, my wife, is not the woman she claims to be." This statement hung in the air between them. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their steady rhythm, but her attention was absolute. "Sincha Mrs. Fortescue came from nothing. She never attended finishing school in Switzerland or lived in Belgravia. She grew up in a Newcastle tenement, the daughter of a dock worker." His voice was flat, emotionless, as though he were reciting facts about a stranger. "She was a shop girl when I met her 20 years ago. Beautiful, ambitious, determined to escape her circumstances. I was a junior clerk at a banking firm, equally determined to rise above my station. We married and created new identities for ourselves, grander backgrounds, better connections. It was harmless at first, just small embellishments. But the embellishments grew," Miss Marple suggested. "They consumed us. Every promotion I received, every social circle we entered, required more elaborate lies. When we moved to St. Mary Mead, Cynthia insisted we completely reinvent ourselves. The old manor house, the expensive wardrobe, the jewels all purchased on credit we could barely afford." He set down his teacup with a clatter. The bracelet was the final straw. She bought it at a pawn shop in London for £30 spaced and gilt, nothing more. But she told everyone it was a Victorian treasure worth £200. Miss Marple's needles paused. "And you discovered the truth?" "I'd always known, of course. But seeing her display that worthless trinket at the bazaar, watching her lie so effortlessly to people who had welcomed us into their community, I couldn't bear it anymore." His voice cracked. "I took the bracelet to Mr. Delroy, told him that story about the anniversary surprise. I thought if I had him create a convincing reproduction, I could somehow make the lie true. Foolish, I know. What did you do with the original paste bracelet?" "I smashed it, took a hammer to it in my workshop and threw the pieces in the river." He laughed bitterly. "Destroying evidence of our fraud, I suppose. But then someone stole the reproduction from the bazaar, and Cynthia insisted we involve the police. I realized the insurance claim, the investigation, it would all unravel eventually. Every lie we've told would be exposed. So you wrote a false confession to end the investigation and attempted to take your own life rather than face the consequences." "I'm a coward, Miss Marple. I've always been a coward. That's why I let Cynthia lead us deeper and deeper into deception." He met her eyes finally, his own filled with desperate pleading. "But I swear to you, I didn't steal the reproduction. When I wrote that confession, I thought perhaps I'd taken it in some fugue state, that my guilt had driven me to unconscious action. But I didn't. I couldn't have. I was never alone near that display table." Miss Marple studied him carefully. After decades of observing human nature, she had developed an instinct for truth, and Gerald Fortescue, for all his weakness and complicity in his wife's schemes, was not lying about this. "Then who did take it?" she asked. "I don't know." "But Miss Marple," he leaned forward urgently, "you must understand something. Cynthia didn't know the original bracelet was worthless. I never told her. She believed she'd gotten an extraordinary bargain at that pawn shop, that she'd outsmarted the dealer. Her fantasy had become her reality. When the reproduction was stolen, She genuinely believed she'd lost a valuable piece. This information settled into place like the final tumbler in a complex lock. Miss Marple's mind raced through the implications, reassembling the sequence of events with this new understanding. Mr. Fortescue James. On Friday evening at dinner with Mr. Delroyd, anything unusual happen? Any odd conversations? He frowned, thinking. Cynthia showed him the bracelet, as I mentioned. He examined it very carefully, seemed surprised by something, asked her several questions about where she'd purchased it, whether she had authentication papers. She became quite defensive, actually, changed the subject rather abruptly, and Mr. Delroy's demeanor after that, thoughtful, quiet. He left shortly after dinner, said he had correspondence to attend to. Mr. Fortescue James's eyes widened. You don't think surely Mr. Delroy didn't steal it? He seems such a gentleman. Miss Marple rose and moved to her writing desk, extracting a piece of paper. Mr. Fortescue James, I need you to look at something. The contract Mr. Delroy showed used one supposedly signed by your wife. You're familiar with her handwriting. Is that signature genuine? He studied it for a long moment. No, it's a competent forgery, but the capital F is wrong. Cynthia makes a distinctive loop. This doesn't have it. Thank you. That confirms what I suspected. Miss Marple returned to her chair, her expression grave. Mr. Fortescue James, I believe I know who took the bracelet and why. But to prove it, I'll need your cooperation and your wife's. Will you trust me? He nodded, the first glimmer of hope lighting his haggard face. Anything, Miss Marple. I'm tired of living with lies. Good. Then this is what we must do. As she outlined her plan, the pieces of the puzzle finally revealed their true pattern. Not a simple theft, but a complex web of deception, counter-deception, and ultimately, a peculiar form of justice that only human nature in all its contradictory complexity could have produced. Chapter 10. The gathering storm. The vicarage drawing room had been selected for the confrontation. Neutral ground where all parties might feel comfortable speaking freely. Miss Marple had requested the meeting for Tuesday evening, and one by one, the principal actors in the drama assembled. Mrs. Fortescue James arrived first, her proud bearing intact despite the strain visible in the tight lines around her mouth. She had dressed with particular care a navy suit that spoke of understated wealth, pearls at her throat. Only the slight tremor in her hands as she removed her gloves betrayed her anxiety. Mr. Fortescue James entered separately, taking a seat as far from his wife as the room's dimensions allowed. The distance between them seemed to encompass more than physical space, was the gulf of broken trust and accumulated lies. Philip Delroy came next, his handsome face carefully composed, but his eyes alert and wary. He nodded to Mrs. Fortescue James, who pointedly looked away. Miss Crane was the last to arrive, escorted by Dr. Haydock, who had called for her personally. She looked fragile and uncertain, perching on the edge of her chair like a bird ready for flight. Inspector Slack stood near the fireplace, his bulky frame radiating official authority. The vicar, Mr. Clement, hovered anxiously by the door, clearly uncomfortable with the proceedings, but unwilling to refuse Miss Marple's gentle request for the use of his drawing. Miss Marple herself sat in a wing chair that afforded her a clear view of everyone present. Her knitting lay in her lap, untouched, a signal to those who knew her well that this was serious business indeed. Thank you all for coming, she began, her mild voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. I believe we can now resolve the mystery of the missing bracelet. though the resolution may surprise some of you. I don't see why we're here, Mrs. Fortescue James said coldly. My husband confessed to the theft. The matter is settled, is it? Miss Marple's blue eyes were sharp, despite her gentle tone. Mr. Fortescue James, would you care to tell everyone what you told me this morning? Gerald Fortescue James's voice was barely audible. My confession was false. I didn't steal the bracelet. I wrote that confession to protect. He stopped, glancing at his wife. To protect me, Mrs. Fortescue James finished her facade cracking, though heaven knows why, after everything I've put you through. She addressed the room at large, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. My husband has just informed me that he's been aware all along that the original bracelet was worthless paste. He knew I'd been deceived by a pawnshop dealer, and rather than tell me, he tried to fix it by commissioning Mr. Delroy to create a better forgery. Delroy shifted in his seat. I maintained that I believed I was creating a reproduction of a genuine piece. Mr. Fortescue James deceived me. Actually, Miss Marple said, I don't believe he did. You're far too experienced in your field to be fooled by paste and gilt. Mr. Delroy, when Mrs. Fortescue James showed you the original bracelet at dinner on Friday evening, you recognized immediately that it was worthless, didn't you? A long silence followed. Delroy's jaw tightened. What if I did? Then several things become clear. You realized that you'd been paid £100 to create a reproduction of a worthless piece. You also realized that Mrs. Fortescue genuinely believed her bracelet was valuable, which meant Mr. Fortescue had deliberately commissioned a forgery to replace what he knew was fake. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. But here's what troubles me, Mr. Delroy. You're a professional dealer in art and antiquities. You must have known that displaying your work at a public bazaar would expose it to scrutiny. Why would you allow that to happen? I tried to dissuade Mrs. Fortescue James from displaying it, Delroy said stiffly. I told her it was too valuable for such a public venue, and yet she insisted, which created a problem for you, didn't it? Because you knew that eventually someone would recognize your reproduction for what it was. Your professional reputation would be damaged, possibly destroyed. Word got out that you'd created a forgery to replace a piece of paste jewelry. People might wonder what else you'd forged. Miss Crane had gone very pale. Philip, tell me you didn't what, Miss Crane? Miss Marple turned her attention to the schoolteacher. Didn't confide in you about his predicament. Didn't suggest that the bracelet's disappearance would solve several problems at once. This is outrageous. Delroy stood abruptly. You're accusing me of theft based on pure speculation. Not speculation, Mr. Delroy. Observation. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. You see, I watched you very carefully at the bazaar. You examined the displayed bracelet with great intensity, not with a lover's admiration or an artist's pride, but with the anxious scrutiny of someone checking that a substitution had been successfully made. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Miss Marple, are you saying Delroy stole his own reproduction? No, Inspector. I'm saying that Mr. Delroy created two reproductions. One he gave to Mr. Fortescue James to replace the paste bracelet. The other, slightly inferior version was what was actually displayed at the bazaar. Somewhere between Friday evening and Saturday morning, Mr. Delroy switched them. Mrs. Fortescue James gasped. But I took the bracelet from my own jewelry box on Saturday morning. You took a bracelet from your jewelry box. But was it the same one you'd placed there Friday night? In the dark, with only lamplight to see by, would you have noticed if the clasps were slightly different? if the settings were marginally less refined. The color drained from Mrs. Fortescue James's face. The clasp. I remember thinking it felt different, but you assumed your imagination was playing tricks. But it wasn't. Miss Marple turned back to Delroy. You entered the manor house during Friday night, perhaps. You had a key made from an impression taken during one of your portrait sessions, switched the bracelets. Then, on Saturday, during the confusion of the raffle drawing, when everyone's attention was focused on the platform, you took the inferior reproduction, a simple piece of misdirection. Why? Dr. Haydock asked, bewildered. If he'd already retrieved the better reproduction, why steal the inferior one? Because, Miss Marple said, Mr. Delroy needed the theft. He needed the scandal, the police investigation, the insurance claim. Don't you see? As long as everyone believed the stolen bracelet was Mrs. Fortescue James's genuine Victorian treasure, no one would question the quality of his work. But he couldn't leave that inferior reproduction on display where someone, knowledgeable perhaps, an insurance assessor might, examine it closely and expose his deception. Miss Crane had begun to cry silently, tears streaming down her face. He told me it was to protect Mrs. Fortescue James from embarrassment. He said if the truth about the paste bracelet came out, she would be humiliated before the entire village. He convinced me he was being kind. And you helped him, didn't you? Miss Marple's voice was gentle but inexorable. That's why you were crying behind the refreshment tent. You'd just participated in a theft, and your conscience was troubling you. Chapter 11. The final revelation. Miss Crane's sobs filled the vicarage drawing room, a sound of absolute desolation that made even Inspector Slack shift uncomfortably. Philip Delroy remained standing, his handsome face a mask of studied indifference. But Miss Marple noticed the white-knuckled grip he maintained on the back of his chair. Miss Crane, Miss Marple said gently, you must tell us what happened. The truth will be far less damaging than continued silence. The schoolteacher fumbled for her handkerchief, pressing it to her eyes. When she finally spoke, her voice was broken and halting. He came to see me on Saturday morning, before the bazaar. He said he'd discovered something terrible, that Mrs. Fortescue James was planning to file a fraudulent insurance claim on a worthless bracelet, and that he would be implicated as the supposed expert who had authenticated it. He said if the bracelet disappeared before the claim could be filed, it would save everyone from scandal. And you believed him? Mrs. Fortescue James's voice was sharp with betrayal. Yes. He showed me documents, insurance papers with inflated values. He said you'd been planning this for weeks. Miss Crane looked up, her face ravaged. I know I've been foolish. I know I let my feelings for him cloud my judgment. But you must understand I was desperate. Without a reference, without employment, I faced destitution. Philip promised that if I helped him, he would ensure I received a position at a prestigious school in London where he had connections. How did you do it? Inspector Slack asked, his notebook at the ready. It was simple, really. Horribly simple. Miss Crane's voice had gone flat. During the raffle drawing, when everyone crowded around the platform, I walked to the display table. I'd practiced the movement a dozen times that morning. Lift the glass dome, take the bracelet, slip it into my handbag. It took perhaps 5 seconds. No one was watching. No one even glanced my way. What did you do with the bracelet? I took it directly to Philip's room at the Blue Boar. He was waiting there. He took it from me and gave me, she broke off, fresh tears streaming down her face. He gave me £20. £20 for destroying my integrity and my peace of mind. Philip Delroy finally spoke, his voice cold and controlled. This is a fascinating fiction, Miss Crane, but it remains your word against mine. You have no proof of any of this. Actually, Miss Marple said quietly, I believe we do. Mrs. Trimble, would you come in, please? The door opened, and the landlady of the Blue Boar entered, her comfortable face set in unusually stern lines. I've been listening outside, as you asked me to, Miss Marple, and I can confirm that Miss Crane came to the inn on Saturday afternoon, around 3:30. She went directly to Mr. Delroy's room. I thought it odd at the time, her being such a proper lady, but I said nothing. You were spying on me. Delroy's composure finally cracked. I was keeping my eyes open, which any responsible landlady does, Mrs. Trimble retorted. And I can tell you something else. When I cleaned Mr. Delroy's room on Sunday morning, I found something under his mattress. She pulled a small cloth bag from her pocket and handed it to Inspector Slack. I brought it straight to the inspector this morning. After Miss Marple suggested I might want to check, Inspector Slack opened the bag and withdrew a bracelet ornate, glittering, and to the untrained eye, quite convincing. Is this the stolen piece? Mrs. Fortescue James leaned forward, studying it closely. I think so. Yes, that's the bracelet I displayed at the bazaar. No, Miss Marple corrected gently. That's the inferior reproduction Mr. Delroy created, the one Miss Crane stole for him. But where, Mr. Delroy, is the better reproduction? The one you switched for the paste original on Friday night. For the first time, genuine fear flickered across Delroy's face. I don't know what you're talking about. I think you do. You see, you made one critical error in your scheme. You assumed that because Mrs. Fortescue James had purchased a paste bracelet from a pawn shop, she would never have it properly appraised. But wealthy women who wear expensive jewelry, even fraudulent wealthy women, tend to insure their pieces. And insurance companies require professional valuations. Mrs. Fortescue James had gone very still. The insurance papers, she whispered. The ones you showed Miss Crandos were forgeries too, weren't they? I never filed any inflated claim. I never had the bracelet valued at all, because she stopped, her face flushing with shame. Because you knew it was worthless, Miss Marple finished. Or at least, you suspected. Mr. Delroy gambled on your pride, preventing you from admitting the truth. Just as Mr. Fortescue James gambled on the same thing when he commissioned the reproduction. But neither of you counted on the other's deception. Dr. Haydock, who had been listening intently, suddenly spoke up. But Miss Marple, if Delroy has the better reproduction, why hasn't he sold it? Surely that was his goal. Was it? Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on Delroy. Mr. Delroy, I've been thinking about your true profession. You told Miss Crane you deal in art authentication and reproduction, but I believe your specialty is somewhat more specific. You don't create reproductions for clients who want to protect their valuables. You create forgeries to replace stolen originals, forgeries good enough to fool owners until the real pieces can be sold discreetly to collectors. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to cease its crackling. You've been studying Mrs. Fortescue James's jewelry collection for months, Miss Marple continued. The portrait sessions were merely an excuse to gain access to the manor house, to observe which pieces were genuine and which might be worth stealing. But when you examined her supposedly valuable Victorian bracelet, you discovered it was paste. You realized you'd wasted months cultivating her friendship for nothing. So he decided to profit anyway, Inspector Slack said grimly. by creating a scandal around the theft of a worthless piece and using poor Miss Crane as his accomplice. Not quite, Inspector. Miss Marple's voice carried a note of satisfaction. Mr. Delroy's real crime was not the theft of Mrs. Fortescue James's reproduction. It was the theft of something far more valuable that occurred on Friday night when he entered the manor house to switch the bracelets. Mrs. Fortescue James stood abruptly, her face draining of color. My emerald necklace. The one my aunt left. Me the only genuinely valuable piece I own. I wore it on Friday evening, then placed it in my jewelry box. When I looked for it on Sunday, it was gone. I thought I'd mislaid it, that in the confusion after the bazaar, you thought many things, Miss Marple said gently. But the truth is simpler. Mr. Delroy took it on Friday night when he made the switch. A genuine Georgian emerald necklace worth at least £500. That was his real target all along. Philip Delroy's face had become a rigid mask. For a long moment, he seemed to be calculating his options. Then, with a movement so sudden it made everyone jump, he bolted for the door. He didn't make it far. Inspector Slack, for all his bulk, moved with surprising speed, catching Delroy's arm and twisting it behind his back. Philip Delroy, I'm arresting you for theft and fraud. As the inspector secured handcuffs around Delroy's wrists, the man finally spoke, his voice bitter. That necklace was wasted on her. She doesn't even know what she has living her pathetic fantasy life, surrounding herself with paste and pretension. Perhaps, Miss Marple said quietly, but it was hers nonetheless. And you, Mr. Delroy, have committed the cardinal sin of those who live by deception. You underestimated the power of truth. Chapter 12. The aftermath of deception. The week that followed Philip Delroy's arrest brought a curious mixture of relief and melancholy to St. Mary Mead. The autumn had deepened, and the village took on the muted tones of approaching winter amber leaves falling in gentle spirals. Morning mists that lingered until noon, and smoke rising from cottage chimneys in thin, contemplative columns. Miss Marple sat in her garden on Saturday afternoon, wrapped in a warm shawl despite the pale sunshine. The emerald necklace had been recovered from Delroy's room, hidden in a hollowed-out art booker, rather obvious hiding place, she thought, for a man who prided himself on sophistication. Inspector Slack had been gratifyingly gracious in his acknowledgement of her assistance, though he'd made it clear in his official report that he'd been following several promising lines of inquiry when Miss Marple's observations had merely confirmed his suspicions. She smiled at that. Some things never changed. Raymond emerged from the house with a tea tray, settling it on the small iron table beside her. You're looking remarkably pleased with yourself, Aunt Jane. Am I? I suppose I'm simply relieved that the matter is resolved. Poor Miss Crane, though. I do worry about her. She's fortunate the prosecutor decided not to press charges, given her cooperation. Raymond poured tea for them both. Though losing her position at the school is punishment enough, I suppose. Actually, Miss Marple said, accepting her cup, I had a letter from her this morning. It seems Mrs. Fortescue James has not only provided her with an exemplary reference, but has also recommended her to a friend who runs a progressive girls' school in Hampshire. The position pays considerably more than her current salary, and there's a cottage included. Raymond's eyebrows rose. That's remarkably generous, considering Miss Crane stole from her. Stole a worthless reproduction, dear. And I think Mrs. Fortescue James understands something about desperation and the compromises it forces upon us. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. She's been to see me several times this week. We've had quite illuminating conversations about her fraudulent background, about her human one. Miss Marple's voice was gentle. Sinci fortescu I jamizor. Sinci is meat. As she was born, has spent 20 years constructing an elaborate fiction because she believed her true self was unworthy of respect. But you know what I told her? That the woman who clawed her way out of poverty through determination and intelligence is far more remarkable than any invented aristocrat. And her husband, they're talking, actually talking. Perhaps for the first time in their marriage. Dr. Haydock says it's quite promising. Mr. Fortescue has agreed to seek help for his anxiety, and Mrs. Fortescue has begun attending sessions as well. They've decided to stay in St. Mary Mead, though they've dropped all pretense about their backgrounds. Colonel Bantry says it's the most sensible thing they've done since arriving. The garden gate creaked, and they looked up to see Miss Crane herself approaching, her face transformed by an expression of cautious hope. She carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. Miss Marple, I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to thank you before I leave for Hampshire. My dear Miss Crane, you're always welcome. Please, join us for tea. As Raymond fetched another cup, Miss Crane settled into a chair, the package resting in her lap. I've spent the week trying to understand how I could have been so foolish. I pride myself on my intelligence, my education, my judgment of character. And yet, I was taken in completely by a common criminal. Not so common, actually, Miss Marple corrected. Philip Delroy was quite skilled at his profession. He'd been operating across 3 counties for nearly 5 years. According to Inspector Slack, he specialized in befriending wealthy women, studying their homes and jewelry collections under the guise of friendship or romance, then substituting forgeries for genuine pieces. You were simply one of many who fell victim to a very practiced predator. That should comfort me, but it doesn't. I let my loneliness and my financial desperation blind me to what he truly was. Miss Crane's voice dropped, and I betrayed another woman, someone I barely knew, because he convinced me she was the villain in his story. You also came forward with the truth when it mattered, Miss Marple pointed out. That takes courage, Miss Crane. More courage, perhaps, than never making the mistake in the first place. Miss Crane's eyes grew bright with tears. You're very kind. I don't deserve your kindness. Kindness isn't something one deserves, dear. It's something one receives and, hopefully, passes along. Miss Marple smiled. Now, what's in that package you're clutching so tightly? Miss Crane unwrapped the paper to reveal a small leather-bound book, its cover worn but still elegant. This belonged to my grandmother, a journal she kept throughout her life. I wanted you to have it. There's an entry from 1898 describing the bracelet, the real Victorian bracelet that my family once owned. She wrote about wearing it to her wedding, about the history of each stone. I thought perhaps Mrs. Fortescue might like to read it, to know the true story of the piece she thought she'd purchased. Miss Marple accepted the journal with reverence. This is extraordinarily generous, Miss Crane. Are you certain? I am. The bracelet is gone sold long ago to pay my father's debts. But the memory of it, the story that should belong to someone who can appreciate it, Mrs. Fortescue has learned to value truth over pretense. Perhaps knowing the authentic history of the bracelet will mean something to her. They sat in companionable silence for a moment, drinking tea and watching the autumn light slant through the garden's remaining roses. A blackbird called from the chestnut tree, its song clear and pure in the still air. Miss Marple, Miss Crane said suddenly, "May I ask you something? When did you first suspect that Philip was behind everything?" "Quite early, actually. It was the way he looked at the bracelet on Saturday morning, not with an artist's appreciation or even a thief's greed, but with anxiety. He was worried about something, and I couldn't understand what until I realized he'd created 2 reproductions. Then everything else fell into place." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "But the real question wasn't who took the bracelet, Miss Crane, it was why. Everyone was so desperate to deceive everyone. Else Mrs. Fortescue James deceiving the village about her. Background: Mr. Fortescue James deceiving his wife about the bracelets. Value: Mr. Delroy deceiving you about his intentions. And you, my dear, deceiving yourself about your own worth. What do you mean? You told yourself you needed that position in Bath because without it you were worthless. But that wasn't true. Your value doesn't come from employment or references or social standing. It comes from who you are, your intelligence, your dedication to your students, your fundamental decency. You made one terrible mistake under extraordinary pressure. That doesn't define you." Miss Crane's tears spilled over. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me as more than my worst moment." After Miss Crane had departed for the station, Raymond turned to his aunt with an expression of bemused admiration. "You do realize you've essentially forgiven everyone involved in this mess? The social cleaning wife, the weak-willed husband, the desperate accomplice. You've found compassion for all of them." "Not all of them, dear. I have no compassion for Mr. Delroy, who preyed on vulnerable women with calculation and without remorse. But the others? They were simply people trying to survive in a world that can be quite unforgiving of our imperfections." Miss Marple picked up Miss Crane's grandmother's journal, running her fingers over its aged leather. "The real crime at the charity bazaar wasn't the theft of a bracelet, Raymond. It was the theft of human dignity, people stealing it from themselves through shame, and stealing it from others through judgment, and you've restored it. I've simply reminded people that we're all rather flawed, and that's perfectly acceptable. St. Mary Mead will go on. People will continue to have secrets and make mistakes, and life will remain endlessly interesting." She smiled. "Which is exactly as it should be." The afternoon light was fading as they gathered the tea things and went inside, leaving the garden to its autumn dreams and the village to its hard-won peace.